Mike Tyson wasn't expecting trouble when he left the diner that afternoon. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk, a group of ordinary-looking men, dressed in polos and jeans, the kind you'd see at a neighborhood barbecue, blocked his path. Their casual smiles masked something uglier, and their words carried the weight of quiet, simmering racism. They thought their subtle jabs and passive-aggressive remarks would be enough to rattle him. But Mike Tyson had faced far bigger fights than a few small-minded men, and he didn't need his fists to show them exactly who they were dealing with. The sun hung low over the city, stretching long shadows across the sidewalks as Mike Tyson stepped out of a small diner nestled on a quiet street corner. He had just finished a simple meal, nothing extravagant, just scrambled eggs and toast. The kind of meal that grounded him, a small slice of normalcy in a world that often felt larger than life. Mike adjusted his hoodie, slipping his hands into his pockets as he walked toward his car, parked a few spaces away. It was supposed to be an uneventful afternoon, just another fleeting moment in a day that didn't need to stand out. But life had a way of throwing the unexpected right in your path. The air outside was warm, carrying the faint scent of asphalt heating under the afternoon sun. As Mike stepped onto the quiet street, he tuned into the familiar rhythm of the neighborhood, the distant hum of traffic, muffled voices drifting from behind closed doors, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Yet something about this moment felt slightly off. Not in a way that announced itself, but in a way that settled deep in his bones, sharpening his awareness. Mike wasn't the kind to go looking for trouble, but he'd been through enough to know when trouble was looking for him. His eyes instinctively scanned the street, and that's when he saw them, four men lingering by a pickup truck parked just a few spots down from his car. Their postures were too casual, their laughter a little too forced, as if they were trying just a bit too hard to blend in. And yet, their presence felt intrusive, filling the space in a way that didn't quite belong. At first it was just a glance, quick, dismissive, the kind of glance you'd give anyone walking past, but as Mike moved closer to his car, that glance lingered a little too long, the weight of their eyes settling on him like a physical pressure, and in that lingering gaze, he felt the shift from mere curiosity to something else entirely. One of the men, a guy in his late 30s with a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead and a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, nudged the guy next to him, whispering something low enough that Mike couldn't hear, but he didn't need to hear it to know exactly what was being said. He'd been in this scenario more times than he cared to count, and he recognized that combination of smug confidence and quiet malice that always came before someone tried to prove a point. The tension in the air thickened with each step Mike took toward his car, the distance between him and the men shrinking while the unspoken energy between them grew louder, and though none of them had said anything yet, their body language spoke volumes, the way they stood a little straighter, the way their casual laughter died down just enough to feel staged, the way their eyes tracked his every move like they were waiting for him to react to their presence. Mike had dealt with plenty of confrontations in his life, both inside and outside the ring, but this wasn't the kind of confrontation that ended with fists flying and clear winners. This was the kind that simmered under the surface, the kind that relied on intimidation and subtle power plays, and Mike knew better than to give them the reaction they were fishing for. As Mike reached for his car door, the man with the baseball cap finally spoke, his voice light and casual, but carrying an undercurrent of something sharper, something meaner. "Hey," he called out, his tone laced with a fake friendliness that was more about testing the waters than making conversation. "Ain't you that boxer? Tyson, right?" Mike turned his head slightly, his face calm, his eyes hidden behind his sunglasses, but his body language giving nothing away. "Yeah," he replied simply, his voice even, offering no invitation for further discussion but not ignoring the comment either. The man chuckled, shaking his head like Mike had just confirmed something he found amusing, but the laugh didn't feel light or genuine, it felt like a hook, a baited line tossed out to see if Mike would bite. "Didn't expect to see you in a place like this," the man continued, his words casual on the surface but heavy with implication. "Thought you'd be in some fancy restaurant or something, not eatin' with regular folks like us." The other men laughed at that, but it wasn't a warm, inclusive kind of laughter, it was the kind that created a divide, that marked Mike as an outsider, that said, "You don't belong here," without having to say it outright. Mike didn't respond immediately. He let the words hang in the air, feeling the weight behind them, knowing exactly what the man was trying to do. This wasn't about curiosity or admiration. This was about setting the stage, about drawing a line in the sand and daring Mike to step over it. "You got something to say?" Mike asked finally, his voice calm, almost conversational, but with just enough edge to make it clear he wasn't in the mood for games. The man shrugged, his smirk widening just a bit. "Nah, just didn't think we'd see someone like you around here. You know, this ain't exactly your neighborhood." The words were delivered with a casual tone, but the message underneath was clear, and as Mike stood there, he noticed the subtle shifts in their positions, the way they moved just slightly closer, the way their shoulders squared, the way their smiles faded into something more calculated. They weren't looking for a friendly chat. They were looking for a reaction. Another man, this one a little older with a sunburned face and a tight jaw, chimed in, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "We were just wondering how a guy like you walks around like he owns the place. You know, thinking maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Mike felt the heat of their words, but he didn't let it touch him. He'd been through worse. Much worse. And he knew that the best way to dismantle this kind of aggression wasn't with violence, it was with calm, with control, with the kind of quiet confidence that made it clear he wasn't rattled. "I don't own anything," Mike said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "But I ain't letting anyone tell me where I can or can't be." The words weren't loud, but they landed hard, cutting through the men's bravado like a knife through butter. The man with the baseball cap took a step closer now, his smile fading completely, his eyes narrowing just enough to reveal the frustration simmering beneath the surface. "You think you're tough, 'cause you were some big shot in the ring?" he sneered, his voice lower now, the fake friendliness gone. "Out here, you're just another guy. And we don't like guys like you strutting around like you belong." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, but Mike didn't flinch. He didn't need to. "You done?" he asked quietly, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to make the question feel more like a statement. The man stared at Mike for a long moment, his jaw clenched, his posture tense. But beneath the surface bravado, there was something else, hesitation. Because what he and his buddies had thought would be an easy target wasn't reacting the way they expected. Mike wasn't afraid. And that fearlessness? It scared them more than anything else. Finally, the man scoffed, waving a hand dismissively as he stepped back toward the truck. "Ain't worth it," he muttered, climbing into the driver's seat. The others followed, their false confidence crumbling as they realized they weren't in control of the situation anymore. Mike didn't move until they were gone, the sound of their truck fading into the distance. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the encounter settle into the quiet street, and then he finally turned back to his car, his heart steady, his mind calm. He hadn't needed to throw a punch. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground without letting someone else dictate the terms of the fight. Mike Tyson had just reached for his car door, the afternoon sun glinting off the polished black paint, when he heard the voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a knife, sharp and deliberate. "Hey," one of the men called out, his voice carrying that fake friendly tone that never really feels friendly at all, like he was pretending to strike up a casual conversation but couldn't hide the edge beneath it. Mike didn't turn immediately. He paused, his hand resting on the door handle, his mind already processing what was about to unfold. He'd been here before. This wasn't just a question, it was an opening shot. "Ain't you that boxer?" "Tyson, right?" the man added, his tone light, but there was something in the way he said boxer, like he was trying to diminish everything Mike had achieved, reduce him to just a label. Mike turned his head slightly, his sunglasses hiding the sharpness in his eyes, but his body language stayed calm, composed. "Yeah," he answered simply, his voice even, offering nothing more than the truth and certainly not the reaction they were fishing for. The group chuckled, low and forced, like they were all in on some joke Mike wasn't supposed to get. But Mike knew the joke wasn't for him. It was about him. The man who'd spoken, the one with the baseball cap pulled low over his forehead and a kind of smirk that never meant anything good, shook his head slowly, like he'd just confirmed something amusing. "Didn't expect to see you in a place like this," he said, his voice oozing casual confidence, but the words were anything but casual. "Thought you'd be in some fancy restaurant or something, not eatin' with regular folks like us." The laughter from the other men wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It wasn't about volume. It was about creating that invisible wall, the kind of wall that says, "You don't belong here," without having to say it outright. Mike stood there for a moment, letting the words settle, feeling the weight of what was really being said. It wasn't about where he was eating. It wasn't even about who he was. It was about who they thought he wasn't. "You got something to say?" Mike asked finally, his voice calm but carrying just enough edge to let them know he wasn't here for their games. The man shrugged, his smirk widening, but his eyes held that flicker of challenge, the kind of look that said he thought he had the upper hand. "Nah, just didn't think we'd see someone like you around here," he replied, letting the words hang heavy between them. "You know, this ain't exactly your neighborhood." It was subtle, but Mike felt it. The way the man's tone dipped just enough to let the real meaning peek through. It wasn't about the neighborhood. It was about Mike. It was about race, status, and the assumption that no matter who he was, he didn't deserve to stand on equal ground with them. The men didn't move, but their presence felt heavier now. Like they were trying to close the space between them without physically stepping forward. It wasn't about fists yet, but it was about power. Mike didn't flinch. He didn't even tighten his jaw. His calm was his weapon. "I don't own anything," he said, his voice steady, measured. "But I ain't lettin' anyone tell me where I can or can't be." The words weren't loud, but they landed like a punch. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. The men exchanged glances, their laughter fading into an uncomfortable silence. They'd expected Mike to get defensive, maybe even angry. But this calm, unbothered response. It threw them off balance. One of the other men, a little younger, with a nervous twitch in his jaw, tried to regain control. "We're just saying, people tend to stick to their own places. That's all." But Mike knew that wasn't all. And so did they. The man with the baseball cap stepped in again, his voice lower now, the fake friendliness gone. "You think you're tough, 'cause you were some big shot in the ring?" he sneered, his posture tightening, his smirk fading into something colder. "Out here, you're just another guy. And we don't like guys like you strutting around like you belong." The words were casual, but the message wasn't. Mike's expression didn't change. His breathing stayed steady. But his eyes, they told the story. "You done?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm, carrying enough weight to make the question feel more like a statement. The man stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched, his posture stiff. But beneath the surface bravado, there was something else, hesitation. Because what he and his buddies thought would be an easy target wasn't reacting the way they expected. Mike wasn't afraid. And that scared them more than anything. Finally, the man scoffed, waving his hand like he was brushing the whole thing off. "Ain't worth it," he muttered, stepping back toward the truck. The others followed, their false confidence cracking as they realized they weren't in control anymore. Mike didn't move until they were gone, their truck rumbling down the street, the tension they tried to create dissolving into the warm afternoon air. He stood there for a moment longer, his heart steady, his mind clear. He hadn't needed to throw a punch. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground without letting someone else dictate the terms of the fight. The afternoon sun hung heavy over the quiet street, its rays reflecting off the polished hood of Mike Tyson's car as he stood there, the weight of the men's words settling over him like a thick, invisible fog that clung to the air, making every breath feel heavier, every moment feel stretched longer than it should have been. The light chatter of the neighborhood, a distant conversation from a passerby, the faint hum of traffic blocks away, faded into the background as the tension between Mike and the group of men crystallized into something undeniable, something that could no longer be mistaken for casual conversation. What had started as a few offhand remarks was quickly morphing into something more deliberate, more pointed, as if each word from the men was a brick being laid in an invisible wall they were trying to build around Mike, a wall designed to box him in, to make him feel like a stranger in a place he had every right to be. But Mike had spent his entire life tearing down walls like that, both literal and metaphorical, and he wasn't about to let these men build one around him without a fight, even if that fight didn't involve throwing a single punch. "You know," one of the men said, his voice dripping with the kind of fake politeness that always seemed to accompany the most dangerous kinds of people, the ones who smiled while they sharpened the knives they were planning to stab you with. "We were just talking about you before you came out here." The man's words were light, casual even, but Mike heard the edge beneath them, the way they were meant to slice beneath the surface, to dig in where they thought it would hurt the most. The other men chuckled softly, nodding along like they were sharing some inside joke, one that Mike wasn't supposed to understand, but he understood perfectly. "Yeah," another chimed in, his voice a little louder, a little bolder now that he felt the momentum shifting in his favor. "Wonderin' how a guy like you walks around like he owns the place." The implication wasn't just in the words themselves, but in the way they were delivered, with the kind of smugness that comes from believing you have the upper hand, from thinking that your numbers, your words, your presence alone are enough to intimidate someone into backing down. As the words hung in the air, thick and heavy, the men began to shift subtly in their positions, their bodies angling slightly toward Mike, closing the physical space between them in increments so small that they might have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but to Mike, it was as clear as a bell ringing in a silent room. They weren't just standing there anymore. They were surrounding him. Not in an overt, aggressive way that could be easily called out, but in that careful, calculated manner that allowed them to maintain plausible deniability while still making their intentions perfectly clear. Their feet shuffled just a little closer, their shoulders squared a little more, their casual postures tightened ever so slightly, like they were preparing for something they weren't ready to admit out loud. But Mike didn't move. He didn't step back, didn't flinch, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing even a flicker of discomfort cross his face. He stood his ground, his posture relaxed but unyielding, his hands still resting calmly by his sides, his breathing steady and even, as if he were completely unaffected by the growing tension. Because the truth was, he was unaffected. Mike Tyson had faced down opponents in the ring who hit harder than words ever could, had stared into the eyes of men who wanted to see him broken, beaten, brought down to their level, and he had walked away from every one of those encounters not just unscathed, but stronger. And this was no different. "You got something to say?" Mike asked, his voice calm, almost conversational, but carrying an undercurrent of strength that made it clear he wasn't asking because he was looking for an answer, he was asking to give them a chance to back down gracefully, before they crossed a line they couldn't uncross. The man with the baseball cap chuckled again, but this time there was less confidence in the sound, a slight waver that betrayed the uncertainty he was trying to hide. "Nah," he said, shrugging like it was no big deal, like the tension thick enough to cut with a knife wasn't pressing down on all of them. "Just didn't think we'd see someone like you around here. You know, this ain't exactly your neighborhood." The words were casual, tossed out like they were meaningless, but Mike knew better. They weren't meaningless. They were meant to provoke, to belittle, to remind him that no matter who he was, there would always be people who saw him as less. Another man stepped in now, emboldened by his friend's words, his voice dropping lower, the fake friendliness stripped away entirely. "Yeah, we don't like guys like you thinkin' they belong here. Walkin' around like you own the place, like you're better than the rest of us." The shift from passive-aggressive comments to outright hostility was subtle but undeniable, and Mike felt it settle over the group like a storm cloud gathering overhead, ready to break open at any moment. But he wasn't afraid of storms. Mike's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady, his tone calm and controlled. "I don't own anything," he said, his eyes locked onto the man who had spoken, his gaze steady and unwavering, "but I ain't lettin' anyone tell me where I can or can't be." The simplicity of his words belied their power, and as they echoed in the space between him and the men, he saw the flicker of doubt in their eyes, the brief moment of hesitation that signaled they were starting to realize they might have picked the wrong target. But pride is a dangerous thing, and instead of backing down, the man with the baseball cap doubled down, his voice rising slightly, trying to reclaim the dominance he felt slipping through his fingers. "You think you're tough, 'cause you were some big shot in the ring?" he sneered, stepping a little closer now, his posture tightening, his fists clenching at his sides. "Out here, you're just another guy. And we don't like guys like you strutting around like you belong." The words were louder now, harsher, the mask of casual conversation dropped completely to reveal the ugly truth underneath. But Mike didn't flinch. Mike's silence spoke louder than any comeback ever could, and when he finally did speak, his words were soft but carried the weight of a lifetime of battles fought and won. "You done?" he asked quietly, his voice low but firm, each word landing like a blow, not because of their volume, but because of the confidence behind them. The man stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard, but beneath the surface bravado, Mike saw it, the hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty, the dawning realization that they were in over their heads. Finally, the man scoffed, waving a hand dismissively as he stepped back toward the truck, his friends following close behind, their false confidence crumbling with each step. "Ain't worth it," he muttered under his breath, climbing into the driver's seat, the words more for himself than for Mike, a weak attempt to save face in front of his friends. Mike didn't move until they were gone, their truck rumbling down the street, the tension they tried to create dissolving into the warm afternoon air. He hadn't needed to throw a punch. He hadn't needed to raise his voice. Because sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground without letting someone else dictate the terms of the fight. The men's smirks began to fade as Mike Tyson stood firm, his calm demeanor unsettling them more than any raised voice or clenched fist ever could. Their casual arrogance started to crumble, replaced by a flicker of doubt. They'd expected fear, maybe anger, but not this steady, unshakable silence. One of the men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his friends, realizing that their attempt to intimidate wasn't landing the way they'd planned. The man in the baseball cap, who'd led the charge, clenched his jaw tighter, but Mike could see it, the hesitation. After a long, tense pause, the man in the cap scoffed, trying to save face. "Ain't worth it," he muttered, stepping back toward the truck. His buddies followed, their earlier bravado gone, replaced by a heavy, awkward silence. Mike didn't move until the truck's engine roared to life, and they pulled away, disappearing down the street. Only then did he exhale, not from relief, but from the weight of knowing they'd learned a lesson they wouldn't forget. As Mike got into his car, the neighborhood seemed to breathe again. People who'd been watching from a distance gave small, knowing nods. They'd seen what happened, and how Mike handled it. Driving away, Mike thought about how the world hadn't changed much, but he had. There was a time he might have let anger take over, but today, standing his ground without throwing a punch was the real victory. Mike Tyson had faced champions in the ring, but the battles outside were different. They tested not just strength, but patience, restraint, and self-control. That day, he didn't need his fists to win. His presence, his calm, his refusal to be rattled, that was enough. Because sometimes, the strongest statement you can make is standing tall when the world tries to tear you down. And Mike Tyson? He walked away undefeated.